Tonight, we are not listening to tales of battles or crowns. Instead, we slip quietly into the hidden world of medieval kings and their secret obsessions with prostitutes. A world where power met desire, where the most powerful men of Europe risked their reputations and their kingdoms for a night of fleeting comfort. As you listen, let your imagination wander. Picture the narrow, lantern-lit streets, the smell of spiced wine and burning tallow candles, the hushed whispers behind closed doors. These are not tales told with scandal or shock, but slowly, gently, with the calm rhythm of history itself. Before we begin, I'd like to invite you to relax and drift with me into this story. Subscribe to The Boring Historian for more sleepy history. And let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is right now. Now, let us begin. The medieval court, for all its grandeur, was rarely the place of romance and chivalric nobility that we imagine today. Behind the gleaming armor and jewel-studded crowns, the lives of kings were heavy with duty, politics, and constant watchfulness. Every word spoken in the throne room was measured, every gesture watched. The silence of stone corridors carried whispers far, and in such a world, even kings longed for something private. Something human, something that felt like escape. Imagine yourself walking through one of these great castles late at night. The air is cold and smells faintly of smoke from the braziers, mixed with damp stone and the tank of wax from guttering candles. The walls echo with the soft shuffle of servants' feet, but otherwise all is quiet. Beyond the council chambers and banquet halls, the king's private apartments stand in heavy silence. Here, in the stillness of the royal chambers, the thoughts of a ruler wander. It is easy to imagine the contradiction of it. A man who commanded thousands of soldiers, who held the fate of nobles and peasants alike in his hands, and yet who was lonely within his own walls. Queens were often chosen for political alliances, not affection. Court life was filled with etiquette and restraint, not comfort. And so, when desire crept into the mind of a king, it was rarely satisfied within the walls of matrimony. Instead, the thoughts drifted outward to the women of the city. Women who were not bound by protocol, women who offered a form of freedom. Prostitution in the Middle Ages was paradoxical. The church condemned it as sinful, yet towns often regulated and even taxed it, understanding that such a trade could not be erased. In many medieval cities, Paris, London, Avignon, Florence brothels were part of the landscape. Their lanterns glowing softly at night, their windows shuttered, their doorways marked by quiet suggestion. For kings, these establishments were both temptation and relief. They offered what the court could not: anonymity, indulgence, and the illusion of ordinary human contact. Picture the journey. A king, disguised, perhaps cloaked in plain wool rather than silk, leaving the guarded gates under cover of darkness, his breath visible in the cool night air as he made his way into the narrow streets of the town below. The cobblestones glisten with damp, the sound of distant laughter rising from alehouses, mingling with the soft strains of a lute carried on the wind. The smells are thick: roasted meat from street vendors, unwashed bodies pressed together in the night, the sour temps of ale spilled on tavern floors. For an ordinary traveler, these were simply the realities of city life. For a king accustomed to marble halls and perfumed chambers, it was a plunge into another world. The women he might find there were themselves caught between worlds. Some were young and hopeful, seeking survival through their trade. Others were hardened by years of labor, their voices hoarse, their hands calloused, their beauty faded by smoke-filled rooms and hard living. They laughed and sang to attract attention, but behind their eyes lingered the weary knowledge of what tomorrow would bring. To such women, the arrival of a noble or, even a king in disguise, was both a blessing and a risk. The blessing lay in the coin he might leave behind, heavy silver that could feed them for weeks. The risk lay in the power he carried, power that could destroy as easily as it could reward. And yet, despite the gulf between their stations, a strange intimacy could exist in those moments. For a king, speaking to a woman who did not address him with titles or bow before his crown, there was a fragile sense of being seen as simply a man. For the prostitute, touching the hand of someone who commanded armies, there was a fleeting sense of proximity to a world otherwise untouchable. Of course, these encounters were whispered about within court walls. Servants saw more than they admitted. Courtiers traded rumors in quiet corners. The clergy thundered against sin from the pulpits, while the king, seated in his royal pew, listened with an expression of solemn piety. Yet behind closed doors, the whispers persisted. The contrast between public virtue and private desire was a tension that stretched across kingdoms. When we reflect on this, the lesson is not in the scandal, but in the humanity. Kings, often painted in our minds as distant figures of command, were as vulnerable as any man to loneliness, desire, and weakness. Their crowns did not shield them from human need, nor did their thrones ease the silence of cold chambers. What they sought in the dim light of city brothels was not merely pleasure, but a fragile escape from the crushing weight of kingship. As you rest with these thoughts, imagine again the castle at night, the echo of footsteps, the flicker of torchlight, the silence of stone walls. Somewhere within, a king lies awake, restless, thinking of the streets below. Power and desire, loneliness and indulgence, forever twined together like the smoke of a guttering candle. If the castle represented order, power, and divine authority, then the medieval city represented something far more chaotic and alive. Narrow streets wound together like tangled thread, full of noise and movement. A day they were crowded with merchants shouting their prices, beggars tugging at sleeves, and the heavy clatter of carts rattling across cobblestones. By night, however, the tone shifted. Alehouses came alive with drunken laughter. Music lutes, fiddles, and rough voices spilled out of tavern doors. And somewhere within the twisting lanes, marked with subtle signs or lanterns, stood the brothels. These establishments were not always hidden. In many cities, they were regulated by local councils and even supported with rules intended to keep order. In London, for example, the infamous stews of Southwark were officially licensed. Brothel keepers paid taxes. Women were required to undergo health inspections, though the effectiveness was questionable at best. In Paris, entire districts became associated with prostitution, their reputations known to travelers who passed through the city. Far from being pushed entirely underground, brothels were woven into the urban fabric. For a king, these places were both temptation and danger. Entering one openly would cause scandal, but the very secrecy of a royal visit gave it its thrill. Picture the scene: a carriage slipping quietly through the gates at night, drawn by horses whose hooves were muffled with cloth to avoid too much noise, or perhaps a king himself, cloaked and hooded, walking with only one or two trusted companions. The brothel itself might look unremarkable from the outside, a timber-framed house, with shuttered windows and smoke curling faintly from its chimney. But inside, the air was heavy with warmth, laughter, and the scents of spiced wine, burning tallow, and cheap perfume. The women, often dressed in brightly colored gowns meant to attract attention, would gather near the entrance, greeting guests with playful smiles. Their faces were powdered, their hair carefully styled, though the effect was more charming than elegant. Behind them, the sounds of a lute strummed in the corner, mixed with the clinking of cups. The brothel was not merely a place of transaction. It was also a space of social mingling, where men who might otherwise be enemies sat side by side, drinking and forgetting their burdens for a few hours. For a king, slipping into such a place meant stepping out of the rigid hierarchy of the court. Here, men addressed him not as your majesty, but as a paying guest. Here, he could speak more freely, laugh without caution, and perhaps, for a moment, feel less like a ruler and more like a man. The contrast must have been striking: the cold, echoing silence of a royal chamber compared to the crowded warmth of a city brothel filled with chatter and music. Yet the dangers were always present: careless word, a servant who recognized his face, or a courtesan who whispered to the wrong listener. Any of these could expose him. Rumors of kings visiting brothels spread easily. Chroniclers sometimes noted them with disapproval, while the clergy used them as examples of moral weakness. Still, the practice continued, generation after generation. Kings were drawn to these places not only for pleasure, but for the forbidden thrill of secrecy. It is worth remembering that for the women inside these houses, life was very different. Where the king saw freedom from his duties, they saw only labor. Their work was relentless. By day, they might scrub linens, tend fires, and keep the rooms prepared. By night, they were expected to entertain, smile, sing, and give themselves to strangers. The warmth and laughter of the brothel hid the reality of exhaustion, and while kings could leave whenever they wished, returning to their castles and feasts, the women remained, bound to their trade by poverty or circumstance. The contrast is sharp, and it is what makes this history so poignant. On one side, the most powerful men of Europe, whose desires could shape politics and wars. On the other, women with little power at all, surviving from one night to the next. Yet their worlds intersected in those dimly lit rooms, where the music played and secrets were exchanged. Some kings, it is said, even used brothels as places of information. Prostitutes often heard the gossip of nobles and travelers alike. What began as indulgence could turn into politics, with pillow talk carrying whispers of plots, alliances, or betrayals. In this way, a brothel might become an unexpected extension of royal intelligence, its women unknowing participants in the games of power. As we reflect, the lesson is quiet but clear. History is rarely neat. The brothels of medieval cities were not simply dens of sin, as the churchmen thundered, nor were they mere places of pleasure. They were crossroads where the burdens of kings met the struggles of the poor, where laughter and sorrow mingled, and where secrecy wrapped itself around human weakness. And so, as you close your eyes and imagine those narrow medieval streets, let the flicker of lanterns guide your thoughts. Hear the distant sound of laughter, the faint strumming of a lute, the murmur of voices behind closed doors. Within those whispers lies the truth. Even kings, for all their crowns, sought solace in the simplest of human comforts. Paris in the Middle Ages was unlike any other city in Europe. Its winding streets hummed with the energy of trade, religion, and ambition. By day, the great cathedral of Notre Dame cast its shadow across the Seine. Bells tolling through the air as merchants filled the bridges and markets. The scent of fresh bread from bakers' stalls mingled with the less pleasant odors of tanneries and refuse tossed into the river. It was a city of both grandeur and grime, where scholars debated in the halls of the University of Paris, and peasants trudged wearily with baskets of firewood strapped to their backs. But as evening fell, Paris transformed. As the markets grew quiet, shutters closed, and the city's lamps, few, though they were flickered weakly against the encroaching dark. At half-light, another Paris emerged, one of taverns, gambling dens, and brothels. For French kings, this world had a strange and irresistible pull. Take, for example, King Charles VI, often remembered for his bouts of madness. Parisian chroniclers wrote of a ruler who wandered the streets at night, sometimes disguised, sometimes in plain sight, mingling with his subjects in ways that unsettled his advisors. Though many of these tales have a dreamlike quality, part rumor, part warning, they reveal something of a royal tendency. The desire to slip away from gilded halls and into the anonymity of the city. In such moments, brothels offered both temptation and relief. The Parisian brothels of the 14th and 15th centuries were often clustered near the river. Wooden signs marked their doors, sometimes with symbols that alluded to their trade. Inside, the rooms were small, dimly lit by tallow candles that smoked and sputtered. The air smelled of spiced wine, cheap perfume, and the faint dampness of old wood. The furniture was plain, often just rough-hewn benches and straw-stuffed mattresses. Yet for many visitors, including nobles, it represented a place apart, a world where rank and title mattered less than coin. For a French king, stepping into such a place must have been an extraordinary contrast. From palaces decorated with gold-leaf tapestries, where every surface gleamed, to rooms with uneven floors and smoke-blackened beams. From the formality of banquets where every gesture was measured to the unrestrained laughter of courtesans. The women who lived and worked there, dressed in bright gowns of red, yellow, or green, greeted guests with warmth that was at once playful and professional. Their lives were harsh, yet their presence gave the brothel its peculiar sense of welcome. The court itself, of course, was not ignorant of these royal habits. Gossip moved swiftly through the corridors of the Louvre, the medieval fortress that housed the kings of France long before it became a museum. Servants whispered of the king's late-night journeys, courtiers speculated about his companions, and priests thundered in sermons against sin. But kings lived in a world where their authority seemed to stretch from heaven itself, and their actions, though criticized, rarely stopped. It is important, however, to see both sides. For the kings, these encounters were escapes from the crushing formality of rule. For the women, they were work hard, unrelenting, and dangerous. A single night with a powerful man could bring gifts, coins, or even a brief sense of protection. But it could also bring scandal, jealousy, or violence. Power was uneven, and in that imbalance lay both opportunity and risk. Parisian society lived with these contradictions. The church condemned, yet the city taxed. Moralists warned of damnation, yet the streets remained full of business. Kings sat in royal pews on Sundays, listening to sermons against lust, and by night some of them walked the very streets those sermons condemned. The rhythm of public virtue and private indulgence was part of the fabric of the city. As you picture it now, imagine the sound of the Seine flowing under the bridges at night. Hear the distant tolling of bells, the creak of wooden shutters, the laughter spilling from a tavern door. Somewhere in those winding streets, cloaked against the cold, a French king walked, seeking anonymity, comfort, or perhaps only the feeling of being ordinary for a brief while. And the lesson, once again, is not in scandal, but in humanity. Power, wealth, and divine right did not erase desire or loneliness. Kings, like all men, sought warmth against the cold stone of their lives. And in the Parisian night, among the courtesans of the city, they found a fragile moment of escape. London, with its sprawling markets, crooked lanes, and ever-present smoke, was both the pride and the shame of medieval England. From the Tower rising sternly on the Thames to Westminster's stately halls, kings ruled a city full of contradictions. The river itself was its lifeline, crowded with barges, ferrymen shouting, and the smell of fish mingling with sewage tossed from the banks. But just across the water, in Southwark, another world waited: the stews. The word stew, in medieval England, referred not to a dish of meat and broth, but to bathhouses and brothels, places where the lines between comfort and vice blurred. Officially licensed, these establishments stood along the southern bank of the Thames. Just outside the direct jurisdiction of London's civic authorities, they were tolerated, regulated, and even taxed, an odd marriage between necessity and disapproval. For the city's rulers, it was easier to manage prostitution than to pretend it could be erased. Kings, of course, were no strangers to the stews. Chroniclers and poets made sly allusions, noting that monarchs sometimes slipped into Southwark's taverns and houses of pleasure. Though rarely admitted outright, the rumor was persistent enough to become part of the city's lore. Picture the scene. A barge drifting quietly across the Thames at dusk, the water glinting in the fading light, oars dipping softly into the current. A cloaked figure, perhaps a king or noble, stepping onto the muddy bank, the sounds of London fading behind him, as the voices of Southern rose. The stews were lively places. Lanterns swung outside their doors, casting a warm glow on the cobbles. Inside, the air was thick with steam, smoke, and the mingled scents of wine, sweat, and herbs. Music played, rough tunes on fiddles, sometimes accompanied by Bodie songs. Women, dressed in bright gowns of red or yellow, greeted guests with practiced smiles. The atmosphere was part festivity, part business, and entirely different from the rigid formality of court life. For a king used to marble halls and solemn rituals, the contrast must have been intoxicating. Here, no one bowed to him. Here, laughter came easily, unrestrained by etiquette. A woman's hand on his arm, the warmth of a crowded room. The heady taste of spiced aledies were sensations absent from the cold stone chambers of Westminster. Even for a man whose every desire could be met within palace walls, the lure of anonymity was powerful. But like Paris, London's brothels were filled with contradictions. For the women, this life was survival. Some were drawn into it by poverty, abandoned by families, or widowed without means. Others were trafficked or sold, their choices stripped away. To them, a king was not a figure of romance, but a dangerous client, capable of generosity one moment and cruelty the next. A purse of silver could change their fortunes for weeks, but a careless word from the wrong lips could ruin them forever. The church thundered against the stews, calling them dens of sin. Yet the city authorities continued to license them, arguing that prostitution prevented greater disorder by providing an outlet for desire. It was an uncomfortable compromise, one that revealed the gap between moral ideals and practical governance. Kings, seated in solemn pews on Sundays, were as aware of this gap as anyone. Perhaps that was why some slipped quietly into Southwark's shadows, seeking not only pleasure, but a sense of freedom from their own moral stage. There are stories, whispered in chronicles, of English kings and their indulgences. Henry VIII, though of a later era, was noted for his love of women outside of marriage, his affairs woven into the politics of his court. Earlier kings, too, were rumored to seek out London's prostitutes, though details remain blurred between fact and legend. What matters is not the names, but the pattern. Rulers, despite crowns and castles, journeyed to the same places as common men when desire called. The lesson lies in contrast. In Westminster, a king was the center of ceremony, his every movement watched, his words recorded. In Southwark, among the stews, he was one man among many, cloaked by smoke and laughter. For a fleeting hour, the burdens of rule could be set aside, replaced by the warmth of another's company. Yet while kings could return across the river to their palaces, the women remained, their lives tethered to the trade, their futures uncertain. So, as you picture medieval London, hear the tolling of church bells from across the river, the steady slap of water against wooden piers, and the low hum of tavern songs drifting into the night. Imagine a king, cloaked and hidden, stepping through a lantern-lit doorway into the world of the stews. Power and weakness, grandeur and grime, forever entwined on the banks of the Thames. The title of Holy Roman Emperor carried immense weight in medieval Europe. These men were crowned with ceremony, swathed in robes of power, and presented as defenders of Christendom. Yet, beneath the glittering pageantry of the empire, many emperors lived lives riddled with excess temptation, and pleasures that clashed with the image of piety they were expected to uphold. Take Emperor Henry IV, for example, remembered most for his clash with the Pope in the investiture controversy. Henry's political battles were legendary, but chroniclers also whispered of his fondness for women of the court and beyond. His need for company outside his marriage was not unusual for rulers of his age, yet his enemies weaponized these habits, painting him as a ruler who could not control his desires, even while Europe's greatest churchmen condemned him. Later emperors carried reputations just as scandalous. Frederick II, often called Stupor Mundi, the wonder of the world, was not only a brilliant politician and intellectual, but also a man deeply interested in sensuality. His court in Sicily became a place where poets, philosophers, and women mingled in an atmosphere more reminiscent of the pleasure palaces of the East than the austere halls of the German princes. Frederick was rumored to have kept mistresses of many origins, his curiosity for culture matched only by his appetite for forbidden pleasures. To their subjects, the Holy Roman Emperors were meant to be paragons of divine authority. But the reality was far more human men who wielded immense power, yet still fell prey to temptation, often using their thrones to indulge where ordinary men could not. These contradictions between sacred duty and personal indulgence made the emperors both fascinating and deeply flawed figures of medieval history. In the twilight streets of medieval Italy, the courts of great city-states glimmered like lanterns of wealth and intrigue. Florence, Venice, and Milan were not only centers of trade and politics, but also places where desire mingled freely with power. Here the figure of the courtesan emerged not a mere prostitute, but a woman who combined beauty, charm, wit, and influence into a role that shaped the destinies of noblemen and even kings. Step into the ducal palace of Venice on a quiet evening. The scent of incense and rosewater hangs in the air, while the lapping of the canals outside mingles with the faint music of lutes drifting from candlelit chambers. The Doge, draped in silks, presides over a banquet where merchants, envoys, and poets recline. Among them, courtesans move gracefully, their gowns shimmering with imported fabrics from the East, their laughter soft, almost musical. They are not hidden in shame. They are celebrated, treated as companions who could hold a conversation about philosophy as easily as they could stir the heart. Italian princes and kings often sought these women not only for comfort but for counsel. A courtesan might know which alliances were stirring, which rivals plotted in shadows, and which bishop could be persuaded with a gift. In this way, indulgence became entangled with politics. To share a private evening with such a woman was to secure more than fleeting pleasure. It was to gain a confidant who could tilt the balance of a court's intrigues. Yet there was always contrast. Outside the palace gates, poor women of the city stood at corners, their trade rougher and harsher, their lives marked by poverty and risk. While the high courtesans were pampered and praised, these women faced scorn, disease, and the dangers of the law. The gap between the silken halls of the elite and the dirty alleys of the common remained stark, a reminder that indulgence for the few meant misery for the many. Italian courts, with their courtesans, became a stage where power and passion intertwined. The kings and princes who indulged were not merely succumbing to lust, they were participating in a culture where desire itself was politicized. Dressed in velvet and lit by the glow of 100 candles. And so when we think of medieval Italy, it is not only the paintings, cathedrals, and trade routes we must imagine, but also the courtesans whose whispered words and knowing smiles shaped history as much as the proclamations of kings. The medieval Spanish kingdoms, stretching from the green hills of Castile to the sun-baked plains of Aragon, were shaped by two great forces: the unrelenting shadow of the church and the restless appetites of kings who were, in the end, only human. Spain was unique in medieval Europe, for it lived at the crossroads of cultures Christian, Islamic, and Jewish, and its rulers absorbed not only the strict moral codes of Rome, but also the whispered luxuries of the East. Let us picture a Spanish court in the 14th century. The palace halls are cool, built of stone and shaded arcades, while the air outside is thick with the scent of orange blossoms and dust. Monks pass in solemn silence, their brown robes brushing across polished floors, while courtiers gather in side chambers, speaking in hushed tones. At the heart of this world sits the king, a man sworn to defend the Catholic faith. His crown gleams with holy symbolism, yet in his private hours temptation stirs like a restless tide. King Alfonso XI of Castile is perhaps the most telling example. Officially, he was bound to marry Maria of Portugal, a union designed to strengthen royal alliances. Yet Alfonso openly maintained a mistress, Leonor, whose presence at court scandalized both nobles and clerics. Leonor was no passing fancy. She bore the king 10 children, and for years wielded influence that rivaled queens. While the church frowned and moralists whispered, Alfonso persisted, defying papal displeasure and the expectations of his station. In his halls, faith and desire sat uneasily side by side, the incense of chapels mingling with the perfume of private chambers. The contrast was sharp. Common prostitutes in Spanish towns often worked in brothels regulated by local councils, paying taxes and fees for their trade. Their lives were marked by hardship, by the risk of disease, by the judgment of neighbors. Yet for kings, indulgence brought no such regulation. Their desires were veiled by wealth and guarded by walls, though never truly hidden from the watchful eyes of the church. Priests and bishops frequently used such scandals as leverage, reminding rulers that indulgence could endanger not only their souls but their authority. Even in later centuries, the tension endured. Ferdinand, the Catholic, husband of Queen Isabella, was revered as a defender of the faith and a champion of the Reconquista. Yet Ferdinand's reputation, too, was clouded by rumors of infidelity, his eye wandering beyond the piety for which his wife was remembered. Behind the solemn facade of Spain's Catholic monarchy, the same old human impulses pulsed quietly, sometimes threatening to undo the carefully woven image of devout kingship. The Spanish court was, in this way, a theater of contradictions. On one side, strict moral codes pressed by friars and inquisitors. On the other, whispered indulgences, secret liaisons, and courtiers who arranged discreet meetings. The clash was not always violent, but it was constant, a tug-of-war between crown and conscience. Kings prayed before altars, heard masses sung in Latin, and then, hours later, sought comfort in chambers far removed from the solemnity of the church.
Ow.
There is, in these stories, a lesson as soft as the flickering light of a votive candle, that even the most powerful rulers could not escape the weight of desire. They built kingdoms, conquered lands, and defended the cross. yet they struggled with the same impulses as their subjects. The tension between church and desire was not only a matter of scandal, but a reminder that power does not grant freedom from human frailty. And so, when we think of Spanish kings in the Middle Ages, we must imagine not only their banners flying over Granada or their prayers whispered in cathedrals, but also the quiet, hidden indulgences that marked their nights. In this tension, the story of Spain's monarchy finds both its humanity and its contradictions. When we think of kings and their private indulgences, it is easy to imagine only scandal and secrecy, velvet-draped chambers, whispered liaisons, and candlelit meetings away from the eyes of the court. Yet there is another side to this story, one far more practical and perhaps even more revealing. For in the medieval world, lust was not only a private sin or a hidden pastime, it was quite often an economy in itself. Royal courts were expensive machines. They devoured coin for food, clothing, servants, soldiers, and endless entertainments. Behind the pageantry of coronations and banquets stood accountants, scribes, and treasurers who struggled constantly to keep balance between what was spent and what could be collected. And when it came to prostitution, the royal household, the towns, and sometimes the monarch himself were intimately involved in its economics. Imagine the streets of a medieval city under a king's domain. Narrow alleyways twist beneath overhanging timbered houses where lanterns burn through the misty night air. Somewhere down these winding paths, the unmistakable red lamp or painted sign marks a brothel. These houses were often licensed and taxed, the crown or local lords collecting revenue from every transaction. To a king, prostitutes were not only a temptation, but also a source of steady income. In England, King Edward III, remembered for his wars with France and the glory of chivalry, presided over a realm where the City of London openly regulated brothels. The infamous Southwark Stew's public bathhouses that doubled as places of prostitution were officially tolerated. They paid fees to the Bishop of Winchester, and from there, part of the money found its way upward into royal coffers. Every sigh, every coin passed across a table, contributed in a small but undeniable way to the machinery of the kingdom. Elsewhere, similar systems thrived. In France, certain towns licensed prostitutes to work in designated districts. The money they earned helped fund not only civic maintenance but also royal campaigns. In times of war, soldiers were known to frequent women who traveled alongside armies and kings, while publicly denouncing such practices often turned a blind eye. Aware that the very men who fought their battles would not fight well without outlets for their desires. Thus, the economics of lust intertwined directly with the economics of war. But this royal relationship with prostitution was double-edged. On one side, it brought revenue and kept order. On the other, it drained money from kings themselves. A monarch's indulgence in prostitutes, mistresses, or lavish court entertainments could be ruinously expensive. Gold rings, silken gowns, private lodgings, and secret guards. Such gifts drained treasuries faster than most wars. Chroniclers often noted with disapproval how kings bankrupted themselves to maintain women of the court, or to sustain their endless appetite for pleasure. Consider Charles II of England, though technically a later monarch beyond the Middle Age, even absorbed into church rents and taxes, because the money was too useful to ignore. Thus, kings and bishops alike profited from the very thing they denounced, a contradiction as old as power itself. The lesson in this tale is subtle but enduring. Lust was never only about desire. For medieval kings, it was about coin, control, and compromise. It shaped tax rolls, court expenditures, and the balance sheets of kingdoms. To indulge in pleasure was also to participate in an economy that bound even the most private acts to the public health of the realm. And so, when we hear of kings who sought the company of prostitutes, we should not imagine only shadowed chambers and stolen kisses. We should also imagine parchment scrolls in the treasurer's office, ink-stained clerks recording payments, and the steady clink of coin flowing through the veins of the kingdom. For even lust in the Middle Ages came with a bill, and it was often the people who paid. In the grand tapestry of medieval courts, few contrasts were as sharp as those between queens, mistresses, and the poetic dream of courtly love. On the one hand, we find queens, crowned in solemn ceremony, robed in velvet and jewels, their marriages arranged not for affection, but for alliance. Their lives carefully scripted to embody dignity and virtue. On the other hand, there were mistresses, often without titles or noble birth, yet capable of holding a king's heart, whispering in his ear, and steering his choices behind closed doors. And hovering above both realities was the idealized notion of courtly love, sung by troubadours and poets. A fantasy of romance that rarely resembled the raw truths of royal desire. Imagine the queen in her chambers. Tapestries depicting saints or ancient battles hang on the walls. The smell of beeswax candles mingles with the faint perfume of lavender sewn into her garments. She is surrounded by ladies-in-waiting, each trained in propriety and vigilance, ensuring her life is one of decorum and ritual. Her every gesture is observed, her reputation guarded like a fragile relic. She is expected to bear heirs, to embody Christian virtue, and to support her husband's reign with loyalty and grace. Yet love, as we think of it today, was seldom part of her role. Now picture the mistress. Her rooms may be smaller, less ornate, but filled with gifts. Silken gowns imported from Italy, rings set with pearls, or perhaps a carved wooden chest filled with coins. The king visits her chambers quietly, perhaps in the hush of night, when the torches in the palace halls burn low. The mistress does not wear a crown, but she may hold far greater influence than the queen herself. With soft words and knowing glances, she can alter the course of royal favor, shift patronage, and even determine the fates of rival nobles. To be a mistress was dangerous, but it was also powerful. A position gained not through lineage but through charm, wit, and sometimes sheer endurance. Between these two poles lies the poetic dream of courtly love. Troubadours sang beneath the windows of noble ladies, spinning verses of longing, honor, and devotion. Knights swore to serve their chosen lady with loyalty greater than any owed to their lord. It was a vision of love as something pure, distant, and noble. Yet this ideal was often far removed from the king's reality. While poets sang of love that was chaste and unattainable, kings indulged in relationships that were anything but. The poetry served as a mask, a glittering veil draped over the earthy, messy truths of human desire. The contrast is striking. Queens bore the weight of dynasties, their personal feelings often silenced beneath duty. Mistresses lived in the shadows, sometimes adored, sometimes despised, yet free in a way queens could never be. And courtly love floated above it all, a beautiful fiction that inspired art, music, and imagination, even as it rarely touched the practical world of kings and their private chambers. Yet all three, queen, mistress, and courtly ideal, were woven together into the fabric of medieval monarchy. They reveal to us that love in those times was not simple, nor romantic in the modern sense. It was political, fragile, and often a theater where appearances mattered as much as truth. And perhaps there is a gentle lesson here, that behind every crown and every coronation lay the same longings, the same contradictions that have shaped human hearts throughout history. Love, duty, desire, each pulling in different directions, leaving even the most powerful men caught between what was expected of them and what they secretly craved. When we look back on medieval kings, it is not only their wars, laws, or crowns that we must remember. It is also this quiet stage of queens, mistresses, and poets, where love was never simple, but always deeply human. The world of medieval kings and their obsessions with prostitutes did not exist in isolation. Behind the silken curtains of royal chambers and the whispered rumors of the court, there stood the firm, ever-present arm of law. In medieval realms, prostitution was a paradox, condemned as sin by the church, yet tolerated and even regulated by kings and their councils. It lived in a strange twilight space, caught between punishment and acceptance, between morality and necessity. Let us walk together through the cobbled streets of a medieval city at dusk. The bells of the cathedral toll in deep, sonorous tones, calling the faithful to prayer. Monks move through the squares in slow processions, their chants echoing off the stone walls. Yet only a few streets away, the air shifts. Wooden signs swing above doorways, candles glow in narrow windows, and the hum of laughter, singing, and conversation drifts into the night. These are the licensed districts, the stews of England, the bordellos of France. The tolerated houses where the laws of the realm permitted what the pulpit condemned. Kings and their councils often issued laws to contain, not abolish, prostitution. The logic was both pragmatic and financial. To suppress the trade entirely was impossible. Human desire could not be legislated away. Instead, rulers sought to manage it. Brothels were sometimes placed outside city walls, near rivers or markets, where they could be controlled and taxed. Women who worked there were required to wear distinctive clothing, often striped hoods or certain colored dresses, marking them as part of a tolerated but segregated class, yet punishment always lingered in the background. If a woman was caught selling her body outside the licensed areas, she risked fines, imprisonment, or public humiliation. Some towns forced offenders to stand in the market square with shaved heads, their shame exposed to all. In harsher places, women might be flogged, branded, or even banished. The law could turn quickly from tolerance to cruelty, depending on the mood of rulers, the influence of the church, or the politics of the day. The contrast was severe. A king might keep a mistress with lavish gifts, her beauty celebrated in courtly poetry. Yet a poor woman, driven by hunger to the same trade, might be beaten for it in the marketplace. For the rich, indulgence was forgiven. For the poor, it was punished. The double standard reveals much about medieval justice. It was not blind, but keenly aware of status. Some rulers leaned toward regulation with a surprising degree of structure. In France, King Louis IX, later canonized as St. Louis, is remembered for his devout faith. Yet even he recognized that prostitution could not be eliminated. He attempted to keep it under strict control, limiting brothels to certain districts, and ensuring they did not spill too close to churches or noble residences. To Louis, regulation was a lesser evil compared to chaos. His successors would echo this policy, vacillating between tolerance and repression depending on the winds of politics. England, too, offers its share of examples. Under Edward III, the Southwark stews became semi-official establishments, tolerated under the authority of the Bishop of Winchester. The irony was striking. The church itself collected rents and profits from houses of sin, while priests preached against immorality from the pulpit. Yet this contradiction was accepted, for the revenue was steady and the alternative, unlicensed. Gothic vice spilling into every alleyway was deemed worse. And in Spain, under both Christian and Muslim rule, prostitution was likewise tolerated under certain circumstances. Laws often taxed the trade heavily, using the money to support civic projects or even fund military campaigns. Here again we see the tension. Lust was condemned as sin, yet lust was also a source of coin, and kingdoms always hungered for coin. There is, in these contradictions, a quiet lesson about human society. Morality is often preached in absolutes, but lived in compromises. The laws of medieval realms reveal that kings, councils, and bishops understood one simple truth. People will always seek what they are forbidden. And so, rather than attempting to stamp it out, they built cages around it, taxed it, punished it at the edges, and tolerated it at the center. The result was a world of contrasts. By day, sermons rang out in cathedrals, incense curling toward vaulted ceilings, voices raised in chants of purity. By night, lanterns glowed in narrow lanes, doors creaked open, and kings themselves walked the thin line between sin and law. Punishment and tolerance coexisted, like the two faces of a coin, inseparable and forever turning in the hands of power. And so as we reflect on the laws of prostitution in medieval royal realms, we find not a story of simple repression or scandal, but a story of balance, a careful, uneasy dance between the sacred and the profane, between desire and duty, between punishment and tolerance. In the grand halls of medieval courts, power was not only won through swords and treaties, but also through whispers, allure, and carefully managed desires. Prostitutes, courtesans, and mistresses could become instruments in this political theater, where a knight's intimacy was not simply a matter of indulgence, but a carefully orchestrated strategy. Kings, nobles, and even church leaders sometimes used women of pleasure as pawns in negotiations. Bribery and surveillance, transforming what was seen as vice into a tool of governance. In many royal courts, prostitutes could be used to uncover secrets from rivals. A nobleman, too comfortable in the arms of a courtesan, might reveal his plots or ambitions, only for the woman to pass that knowledge back to the king's advisors. At times, powerful rulers even maintained their own networks of women for such purposes, turning intimacy into espionage. These women lived in a dangerous world, valued for what they could offer politically, but discarded or punished when they were no longer useful. But the use of prostitutes as political tools wasn't always about secrecy. It was also about spectacle. Banquets and feasts might deliberately include women of the night, paraded as a sign of wealth and dominance. In this way, rulers reminded their rivals not only of their military power, but of their ability to indulge freely, to bend morality without consequence. For some kings, the display of sexual power was as important as any crown or throne. This intersection of politics and pleasure also created tension with the church, which condemned prostitution, yet turned a blind eye when it served the interests of rulers. Prostitutes became symbols of both corruption and necessity, reminding us that in the medieval world, even the most intimate of acts could be woven into the fabric of politics and authority. In the gilded chambers of medieval palaces, desire carried with it a silent shadow: disease. Behind the silks, the laughter, and the intoxicating allure of pleasure, kings and rulers often placed themselves at enormous risk. In an age when medical knowledge was limited and cures were unreliable at best, the pursuit of prostitutes and mistresses was not merely a moral danger, it was a physical one. The most dreaded of these risks was syphilis, though it would not strike Europe until the late 15th century. Earlier, however, there were many other venereal diseases and infections, gonorrhea, curse, and a host of unnamed afflictions that spread rapidly in brothels and courts for ordinary people. These were sources of shame and pain. For kings, they could be catastrophic. A ruler's health was not just personal, it was tied to the stability of an entire kingdom. A king weakened by disease might be less capable of commanding armies, negotiating treaties, or even producing legitimate heirs. Whispers about the illnesses of rulers often spread quickly, turning into tools of political rivalry. Enemies would seize upon any sign of weakness, and rumors about a king's indulgences could be used to undermine his authority. A monarch known to frequent prostitutes might be mocked not just for immorality, but for poor judgment and lack of self-control. In some cases, entire courts became suspiciously unhealthy, as kings passed their afflictions on to lovers, mistresses, or even unsuspecting queens, leading to further scandals that could shake dynasties. Attempts at prevention were crude and often ineffective. Herbal washes, vinegar rinses, or even mercury ointments were applied, though they often did more harm than good. Physicians, bound by both superstition and limited knowledge, struggled to treat diseases of desire, sometimes recommending prayer and penance alongside dubious remedies. The Church, while condemning prostitution, also acknowledged its persistence and sometimes interpreted disease as divine punishment for lust. Yet kings were rarely deterred for long. The risks of illness were weighed against the intoxicating lure of intimacy and power. Pleasure was both a balm and a poison, something that could soothe the loneliness of a crown, but also carry the seeds of downfall. In this way, the disease of desire haunted royal courts as much as any political enemy. An invisible reminder that even the most powerful were still bound to the vulnerabilities of flesh. If one wishes to understand the peculiar fascination medieval kings held for prostitutes, one must also look outward beyond the gilded doors of their palaces to the cold and drafty hovels of the common folk. For while rulers indulged themselves in luxuries, perfumed courtesans, and clandestine encounters in richly furnished chambers, the poor lived in a world that could not have been more different. The contrast between the palace and the street was so sharp that the existence of prostitution itself became a bridge, albeit a troubling one between two worlds. Step first into the palace. Imagine vast halls lit by flickering torches, the stone walls softened by tapestries depicting saints or battle victories. The air is thick with incense and the heady sweetness of spiced wine. Music drifts from a chamber harp, and noblemen and noblewomen laugh in measured tones. Here, a king's desire is not starved, but fed, nurtured by ceremony, wealth, and constant access to beauty. When the king sought pleasure, he could summon it whether through courtesans from abroad, discreet brothel visits under disguise, or carefully arranged liaisons with women of court. Now, step outside those palace gates. A few paces away, the cobbled streets tell another story. The air smells of damp straw, animal dung, and smoke from cheap hearth fires. The poor crowd into wooden shacks where entire families share a single room. All meat is rare, bread often stale, and illness hovers in every shadow. For peasants, prostitutes were not elegant courtesans in silks, but women of desperation, widows, abandoned wives, or daughters of laborers who turned to selling their bodies as the only way to earn bread. Where a king's mistress might bathe in rosewater, the street prostitute washed herself, if at all, in cold river water, clouded with filth. This disparity was not lost on medieval society. Kings, surrounded by plenty, treated sex as indulgence or entertainment, while the poor sought bound up with hunger, survival, and shame. The same act, prostitution, carried utterly different meanings, depending on the class of those involved. For the wealthy, it was veiled in secrecy, whispered about in courtly gossip. For the poor, it was visible and raw, occurring on backstreets, in makeshift rooms above taverns, or even against the walls of the very churches that condemned it. In some cases, kings used their fascination with prostitutes as a way to taste the life of the commoner, however briefly. There are stories, half legend, half truths, of rulers disguising themselves in plain cloaks, slipping out of their palaces at night, and mingling in taverns where the ale was cheap and the women cheaper. These moments were as much about curiosity and power as they were about lust. To a king, even vice could be a performance of sovereignty, to show that nothing, not even the boundaries of morality, could deny him what he wished. Yet for the poor, the consequences of desire were severe. A peasant woman caught selling her body might face public shame, fines, or even physical punishment, while the men who bought her services often slipped away without consequence. A king, however, faced no such risk. His reputation might suffer in whispers, but his body was protected by guards, his pleasures shielded by courtiers. The imbalance of power was stark and inescapable. This division also revealed itself in health, where the king might afford physicians, ointments, or imported remedies to treat the diseases of desire. The poor had nothing but herbs gathered from fields, or the false hope of a healer's charm. Suffering was endured in silence, and many lives were shortened not only by poverty, but by the risks of survival in a world where even intimacy was dangerous. Reflecting on this contrast, one sees how prostitution became a mirror of medieval society itself. It highlighted the gulf between rich and poor, palace and hovel, privilege and desperation. For the king, a prostitute might be a diversion from the weight of rule. For the poor, prostitution was often a grim necessity, undertaken in cold rooms with hunger pressing at the door. And so, while kings indulged themselves under gilded ceilings, peasants trudged through mud and rain. Two worlds, bound by the same act of human desire, yet separated by layers of wealth, power, and consequence. In the quiet of history, we see this contrast not as scandal alone, but as a reflection of the enduring truth. The same human impulses that comforted a king could destroy a peasant. For centuries, kings and nobles did not merely tolerate prostitution. Many actively supported, regulated, and even funded it. Brothels, particularly in the medieval period, were not only places of illicit desire, but also institutions with political and economic significance. Royal patronage, whether open or discreet, lent legitimacy to these establishments. Yet as Europe marched toward the Renaissance and beyond, this pattern slowly began to unravel. The decline was not sudden but gradual, shaped by shifting religious pressures, changing ideas of morality, and the growing visibility of disease. Imagine the scene in the 13th and 14th centuries. In cities such as London, Paris, or Nuremberg, brothels operated with licenses from the crown or from municipal authorities. Kings understood their importance. They were seen as a lesser evil, a way to control lust that might otherwise spill into adultery, violence, or the violation of respectable women. Royal treasuries often collected fees from these establishments, which turned prostitution into a source of revenue for both king and city. In some towns, brothels stood under royal protection, marked with signs or banners so that even travelers knew where sanctioned indulgence could be found. But with every passing century, cracks in this system began to show. By the late medieval period, the church was intensifying its condemnation of sexual vice. Priests thundered from pulpits about the sin of lust, and while kings were often shielded from open criticism, they could not escape the moral climate entirely. The Black Death of the 14th century also brought suspicion. Many believed that moral corruption such as prostitution was a cause of divine punishment. Brothels were attacked in some towns, prostitutes were blamed for spreading disease, and the king's connection to such places became more difficult to justify. The 15th century added another layer of complication: the arrival of syphilis in Europe. Suddenly, prostitution was not only a moral threat, but a visible, devastating health crisis. Outbreaks in cities frightened rulers who began to close or heavily regulate brothels to protect both soldiers and citizens. What had once been considered a controlled outlet for desire now appeared to be a breeding ground for illness. Kings who once granted protection began to withdraw it. There were also political changes at work. As monarchies grew more centralized, rulers became increasingly concerned with their image. A king who patronized prostitutes or supported brothels too openly risked appearing weak, corrupt, or overly indulgent at a time when royal authority was supposed to represent order and divine justice. For earlier kings, indulgence had been almost expected. By the Renaissance, it was a liability. Courtiers whispered, chroniclers noted scandals, and reputations could be tarnished by rumors of brothel visits. For the poor, this shift had mixed consequences. On the one hand, the decline of official patronage meant less protection for prostitutes, who found themselves increasingly vulnerable to arrest, assault, and poverty when brothels were closed or driven underground. On the other hand, some reformers argued that closing brothels was a step toward protecting women from exploitation. But the reality was harsher. Without the backing of royal or civic licenses, prostitution simply became riskier, and the women who survived through it were left without the fragile safety net they once had. Within the palace, too, the change was felt. Kings still desired women outside of marriage, but increasingly they favored mistresses over prostitutes. Mistresses, unlike anonymous brothel workers, could be integrated into the court, given estates, titles, and recognition. The age of royal mistresses is powerful. Glamorous women who wielded influence in politics arose as the patronage of brothels waned. Desire did not disappear, merely transformed into a more respectable, or at least more controllable form. By the 16th century, what had once been routine royal indulgence in public brothels had largely faded into memory. Kings continued to seek pleasure, of course, but less often in the company of common prostitutes, and more through private liaisons, hidden from public view. Brothels themselves continued, but they lost the explicit patronage of kings and the protection of royal law. In many ways, this shift mirrored broader changes in European society: the rise of personal reputation, the tightening influence of religious morality, and the growing fear of disease. In reflecting on this slow decline, one sees not only the changing face of prostitution, but also the transformation of monarchy itself. Medieval kings had once been figures who could indulge openly, shielded by divine right. By the early modern period, rulers had to appear more disciplined, more moral, and more conscious of how they were perceived. Brothels, once a symbol of royal tolerance, became symbols of corruption to be distanced from the throne. Thus, the story of brothels and kings is also the story of Europe's gradual shift from medieval indulgence to Renaissance self-consciousness. It reminds us that power, no matter how absolute it may seem, is always tethered to the pressures of society, pressures that even kings, in their moments of private desire, could not entirely ignore. As we near the close of this long, meandering journey through medieval palaces, brothels, and streets alike, it is worth stepping back for a final reflection. The story of kings and prostitutes is not only a tale of indulgence or scandallit, is at its heart a reminder of the fragility of power and the enduring pull of human desire. Imagine again a medieval king in all his glory. He sits upon a throne draped in rich fabrics, his crown gleaming with jewels imported from far-off lands. Courtiers bow and murmur, soldiers kneel, and the church itself blesses his reign. He commands armies, collects tribute, and signs decrees that can shape the lives of millions. And yet, in the quiet hours of night, he seeks the company of a woman who owns nothing but her beauty, her wit, and the will to survive in a harsh world. The imbalance of power is staggering. The king, who seems untouchable, is drawn irresistibly to someone who lives on the margins of society. This juxtaposition reveals something deeply human. No matter how elevated a person may appear, desire reminds them of their vulnerability. A king could control the laws of his land, but not the restlessness of his body. He could command loyalty from knights and nobles, but he could not command the subtle thrill of intimacy, or the comfort of being seen not as a ruler, but simply as a man. In this way, prostitutes became both a pleasure and a mirror, reflecting the hidden insecurities of kings. The fragility of royal power is also seen in the risks these indulgences carried. As we have traced, disease haunted the corridors of pleasure, spreading silently and reminding rulers that even they could be undone by the smallest of afflictions. Rumors, too, were a danger. A whisper in a courtly hall that the king had been seen visiting a brothel, or that a mistress had been taken from humble origins, could ripple into political scandal. In monarchies built on reputation and divine favor, such gossip could shake confidence in the throne. Kings who believed themselves invincible often found their reputations corroded not by armies, but by their own desires. For the poor, watching from the outside, this fragility often remained invisible. To them, the king's wealth was untouchable, his pleasures unreachable. Yet in truth, the poor and the prostitute often held more power than they realized. A single courtesan could influence royal decisions, whisper secrets that changed political alliances, or demand gifts that strained a treasury. A prostitute of the streets, though despised and condemned, represented a temptation strong enough to draw a king from his gilded safety into the mud and shadows of the city. Over time, as we have seen, the open patronage of brothels declined, placed by the carefully guarded relationships between kings and royal mistresses. But even this shift does not erase the central lesson. Whether through the raw encounter in a tavern, the hidden brothel visits, or the celebrated mistresses of later courts, kings remained tethered to their own humanity. They could not escape the long shadow of desire. This reflection also reminds us of the broader truth of history. Those who appear most powerful are often most vulnerable in unseen ways. The medieval king may have seemed mighty, yet his reign could be weakened by whispers, disease, or the choices of those far below his rank. In the end, prostitutes and courtesans women who were often ignored in official chronicles played a subtle but undeniable role in shaping the private lives of rulers, and sometimes even the destinies of kingdoms. As you rest now, perhaps you can imagine both sides of this world. The glittering candlelight of a royal chamber, heavy with perfume and soft fabrics, where kings indulged their hidden desires. And outside, the cold night air of medieval streets, where women shivered under thin cloaks, waiting for a coin to keep hunger at bay. Were two worlds bound together by human need, desire, and fragility. And in these contrasts, we find the most calming truth of all. History is not only about battles and crowns. It is about the quiet, ordinary impulses that touch us all: the need for companionship, the search for comfort, and the unshakable vulnerability that makes even the strongest among us human. History reminds us that even in grandeur, there is weakness. Even in indulgence, there is consequence. And even in the mightiest king, there is a fragile man moved by desires as timeless as the night.